We all like to think that our ideas are our own. The things we care about, the things we're passionate about, they come only from us, don't they? But what if I told you that often the ideas are discussed by politicians, the very subjects that you yourself might think are really worthwhile, they aren't plucked from thin air, they don't come just from you, they're actually paid for by political donors, paid for by anonymous corporations, who can spend money in our politics to put issues, to put policies on the political agenda. Sometimes they might be policies that are good for you, but sometimes they might be policies that aren't good for you. They might be policies that deregulate economies, that strip away workers' rights, or that transform the very world in which you live in. And you don't know anything about it because you will not know where that money has come from. Dark money is unaccountable money that seeps into the political process and changes our politics and changes things that happen, the policies that are enacted without us knowing anything about it really. So it's everything from unaccountable donations to political parties, donations that are made through shadowy companies or offshore accounts that we just don't know about where that money comes from, to secretive lobbying by think tanks that don't declare who their donors are. So if you're a think tank and you get money, say, from a big oil company or tobacco company, you don't have to declare it, but you can also go and lobby government on behalf of these companies. You can appear in the media and you don't have to declare that either. You don't have to declare your connection. So that's all dark money that comes into our political process. Also, it can take place online. So if you see things like, Facebook advertisements, fake accounts on Twitter, the whole gamut of bots, that can all be manipulating our politics. So that's also a form of dark money. So it's all different types of ways in which money is spent in our politics that warps it and distorts it in ways that we as citizens can't understand properly. Well, the story of my journey into the world of dark money actually began back in June of 2016. It was a couple of days before the Brexit referendum, and I was in the town of Sunderland in the northeast of England, and I was working as a reporter. And I'd gone to Sunderland to try and find out about Brexit, how people felt about it. But while I was there, I noticed something interesting. I was on a train and I picked up the Metro, the free newspaper, and there was an advert on the front that said, "Take back control," which was the big Vote Leave Brexit slogan. But on the back of the advert, it was a big advert, and the back of it said, "It's paid for by the Democratic Unionist Party." And I thought that was interesting. I'd worked in Belfast before, I knew the DUP. Why was the DUP spending money on adverts in Sunderland? So I started getting interested in that, and I went to Adam Ramsey at Open Democracy, and we started doing an investigation into this. Like, where and why was the DUP spending money during the Brexit referendum in the northeast of England? And what we discovered really surprised us. We discovered that the DUP had spent a lot of money. They spent almost £500,000 during the Brexit referendum, all in the last few days of the campaign. But we didn't know anything about where the money had come from because it had come in under a loophole in Northern Irish law from the conflict of the Troubles, which meant that political donors were secret. But in 2016, that could be used to put money into the DUP to spend across Britain on the Brexit campaign. So I started really researching that, trying to find out what was going on. We discovered that the money had come from a shadowy group called the Constitutional Research Council, which sounds very formal and very impressive, but actually has no legal standing. It doesn't have a building, it doesn't have a list of members, it doesn't file accounts, but was run by a man called Richard Cook, who is a businessman living on the outskirts of Glasgow. He has never claimed that the money came from himself, but 4 years later, there's still no transparency about where this £435,000 that went to the DUP came from. One of the most striking things about British politics is how far money will go and how easy it is actually to buy access and to become a really big player in British politics by giving money. One of the best examples of that is a man called Aaron Banks. Aaron Banks was the biggest donor in the Brexit referendum, and he'd really come out of nowhere. He'd given a few £1,000s to the Conservative Party earlier, he'd given some money to UKIP, most people didn't know who he was, and then he appears during the referendum for Brexit, big backer of leaving the European Union, and he's spending millions and millions and millions of pounds. Aaron Banks spent his campaign Leave.eu was really influential, I think, during the referendum in that it pushed very hardline messages around things like immigration. It really pushed these kind of fearful, emotive buttons of voters. And subsequently, I and my colleagues have did a lot of investigations into Aaron Banks, into his businesses. There's a lot of questions about just how much Aaron Banks is really worth, about aspects of his relationship with Russia. He has kind of long-standing ties with Russia as well, and also about just exactly what his campaign did during the Brexit referendum. It was subsequently fined by the Information Commissioner's Office for breaking data protection laws during the Brexit referendum, and was fined by the Electoral Commission. But what's most interesting really about the story of Aaron Banks is it's a story of how one man and his money was able to really manipulate and change our politics in ways that we hadn't seen before. We probably hadn't seen somebody come along and spend this much money and then really vanish from politics as well. He's never given anything like that kind of money since then. He's kind of disappeared in some ways from the political scene. In many ways, the story of Vote Leave is the story of Britain now. Vote Leave was the biggest campaign during the Brexit referendum. It was headed by Dominic Cummings, who's now the Prime Minister's trusted aide and really the power behind the throne in British politics. It was fronted by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. These were the people who stood next to the Vote Leave's bus that said, 350 million to the NHS if we leave the European Union. And it was the biggest campaign really in kind of the referendum to leave the EU. And the story of Vote Leave during the campaign, we found out through investigation subsequently, was quite different to the story that you saw publicly. Yes, it was this insurgent campaign. Yes, it did manage to get its victory. But also what was going on behind the scenes was the campaign had broken electoral law by funneling money to other campaign groups, because in Britain you're only allowed to spend a certain amount of money during an election campaign. Vote Leave was found to have broken the law by funneling money to others to spend on its behalf. So basically the biggest campaign in British political history had broken the law. The people who are in charge of Britain now had broken the law. But also we found out that what Vote Leave was saying offline and online were really different. So offline in debates, Vote Leave was talking about sovereignty and the importance of Britain becoming a kind of global Britain, a trading nation. But in Facebook ads and in other ads on social media, where Vote Leave spent almost all of its money, it pushed very different messages. It talked about things like Turkish immigration, about Turkey joining the European Union, which wasn't going to happen. And it really played into, again, a lot of those concerns around fear and anger that voters have. And what's really striking is once these questions started to be asked, Dominic Cummings refused a series of requests by a parliamentary inquiry into fake news to come to Parliament to explain how Vote Leave worked. He refused to take part, but yet that didn't stop him being able to be appointed a senior advisor to Boris Johnson. And to this day, really, you could argue that Vote Leave are now effectively the British government, and that many of the ways that Vote Leave operated, bending the rules as far as they will go, really not caring all about that much about norms or values or the way you would do politics transparently, it kind of is carried over now into Downing Street, and there's a lot of similarities between that campaign of 2016 that won the Brexit referendum and how Downing Street works now. Dominic Cummings has written a lot about his beliefs. He's got these long blog posts, these screeds about the importance of artificial intelligence, the importance of reforming Whitehall, of completely radically changing it. Some people might compare him to someone like Robespierre, the architect of the French Revolution. And there's definitely a kind of revolutionary zeal about Dominic Cummings. It's quite hard though to tell exactly what Dominic Cummings believes. And we've almost gotten to this situation in Britain where what Dominic Cummings believes is the most important thing about the direction of travel of the government. It's clear that from his writings that Dominic Cummings does see the kind of traditional structures of power as something to be circumvented and avoided. And it's one of the things that's most interesting is the man who headed up a campaign, Vote Leave, whose message was take back control, really seems very keen on actually centralising control within a small number of departments in the British government. And we're really seeing a huge radical change, not just to the civil service, but actually to how government itself works. Historically in Britain, departments have actually been quite semi-autonomous. Ministers have had a lot of power of themselves. Ministers have often clashed with the Prime Minister without losing their jobs. That doesn't happen now. There really is only a couple of key ministries in government. the relationship between the Treasury and number 10, which is the Prime Minister, has really changed from being a relationship of equals to one in which there's only one power centre, and that is the Prime Minister. And it feels as if what Dominic Cummings is trying to do is to remodel British democracy into something that looks probably a lot more American, where you have a Prime Minister who's quite presidential at the top of it, and who is able to rule by decree. You know, some might argue that's a good place to be. Some might argue that, you know, how Britain's worked hasn't worked, and it's got us into the state we are in now. But for someone like me, I think there's a concern about changing all of this in such an untransparent way, that we are seeing this radical reshuffling, changing of the ways in which government has worked for a very long time, and we're not having any conversation about it. The only person that seems to matter in the room on this is Dominic Cummings. You could argue that the European Research Group are possibly the most important group in British politics that almost no one had heard of. You know, this is a small backbench club for Conservative Party MPs who used to just meet and talk about the EU. They were Eurosceptics in the years in which Britain was very much a member of the European Union. But then in 2016, after the Brexit vote, the ERG was kind of reformulated in a very different way. It became this kind of very, very hardline pro-Brexit group that used to appear on the television, on the radio as spokespersons for the ERG, even though it was just part of the Conservative Party. And in my investigations, one of the things I found really interesting was how the European Research Group was actually funded by taxpayers. So how the ERG worked was that every MP in it would give £2,000 a year from their MP's allowances to the ERG to fund its research. And that meant that the ERG had kind of cash to hire researchers, to put out things like briefing documents, to kind of become a political player. Before the Brexit referendum, it hadn't really bothered doing anything of that. It used the money mainly, you know, to pay a researcher and to have a few nice lunches. But after the Brexit referendum, it used it really cleverly to change the direction of British politics. If the European Research Group hadn't opposed May's deal so firmly, Theresa May's deal so firmly, we probably would have left the European Union a couple of years ago on very different terms than we have now. And what was interesting to me as a journalist is I asked, okay, if the European Research Group does research, I'd like to see it because it's paid for by taxpayers. So we wrote a Freedom of Information request to the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority who looks after this. My colleague Jenna Corduroy wrote the request and asked to see this research because it had been paid for by us. And IPSA said that we couldn't show it to us. It would damage potentially their relationship with the European Research Group. And so what we did was we ended up having to go all the way to a court 18 months later to a tribunal, an information tribunal, in which we actually won against the lawyers representing the Information Commissioner's Office and the European Research Group. And we were able to get hold of this research, which unsurprisingly, experts we talked to did not think very much of this research. They said it was very flimsy and really wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and certainly not worth spending significant amounts of taxpayers' money on. But if we hadn't gone all the way to a court, spent all that time and energy and money, we still would never even seen this research the European Research Group was producing. And the European Research Group was another really good example of how small amounts of money, some of it private, they got private donations, some of it public, but with a really hardcore, dedicated team of researchers and MPs behind a very specific vision, a kind of Singapore-on-Thames vision of a really deregulated Britain, close to America, very far away from the European Union, minimal standards for things like workers' rights, for environmental protection, and they were able to really push that agenda so far without almost anybody noticing properly. It's long been a dream for certain sections of the Conservative Party to kind of pull Britain far more into America's orbit. So if you look at somebody like Liam Fox, the former Defence Minister, the former Brexit Minister, the International Trade Minister, he spent the early days of his political career setting up a thing called Atlantic Bridge. And this was a charity that was really all about building links between the kind of White House at the time, which is the Bush administration, and British Conservatives. That charity ended up being wound down when it was revealed that Mr. Fox's best friend had been attending meetings with him as the Defence Minister about 15 years later. But in the interim period, it was able to build a lot of connections between Westminster and Capitol Hill. Mr. Fox and Atlantic Bridge are not alone. On the right of British politics, for a long time, there's been a desire from a small group, mainly think tanks, mainly of Conservative MPs to reimagine this relationship with between the United Kingdom and the United States, and to move away from the European Union and towards the United States. And in some ways, Brexit was a perfect opportunity for that. A lot of these groups, both in Washington and in London, who were in favour of this, really for a long time had supported the idea of Britain leaving the European Union. And they talked to this idea of the Anglosphere, which is basically like a collection of English-speaking nations: America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And we heard a lot about this actually in the run-up to Brexit, and actually at times in the years afterwards. And this idea was really, really strongly felt and really strongly held, that Britain really wasn't like other European countries. It was really part of this Anglosphere. And this idea of global Britain, this idea of Britain changing its role in the world, really can be traced back to that. Margaret Thatcher was a big supporter of it too. And it came to become a really kind of important talking point in British politics in the years before and after the Brexit referendum. And Boris Johnson has talked about it too. And what's really striking again is what you see with this is a small group of people, often working for think tanks who are paid by anonymous donations, have really been able to shift the political conversation in Britain from 5 years ago, when almost no one talked about the Anglosphere, to a kind of position where in the pages of the Telegraph and similar newspapers, these are the kind of discourses and ideas that are still being kind of pushed further and further. The story of dark money in British politics, I think, is really the story of the Americanization of British politics. So for decades in America, what you saw was anonymous donations, mainly on the right of politics, from people like the Koch brothers, who are oil billionaires, to Republican causes, to Republican think tanks, to universities as well, really shifted massively the conversation in America on politics. Take climate change. Climate change went from something that most people agreed on to something that's now a partisan issue. What's happening in Britain, and what's happened in Britain, I think, is that we've seen similar types of politics emerge here. You're seeing anonymous donations going to political parties who are changing their views on things. You're seeing the growing importance of anonymously funded think tanks in getting policy ideas onto the agenda. You're also seeing the rise of kind of small groups of highly motivated MPs, like the European Research Group, who act as kind of bulwarks for radical ideas within Parliament on the fringes of political parties, what you might call a party within a party. And all of this adds up together to this kind of change in British politics, where money and influence and untransparent money and influence, unaccountable money and influence, have shifted and changed the terms of debate in British politics. So much so that I often think we don't really realise it ourselves. We don't like to think that money can change how our politics is run, and even how we ourselves think about issues, but it really can. If you've ever turned on your television or read a newspaper, you'll have seen a British think tank. And they've often got really, really impressive names, things like the Institute of Economic Affairs, Policy Exchange, and they sound really trustworthy and independent, and that's basically the idea behind it. They sound like these are neutral voices. They often come across as neutral voices, telling you independently what they think on an issue. But actually, most of these think tanks do not declare where their money comes from, so they're anonymously funded. So we don't know where the kind of influence behind these ideas is. But not only that, a lot of them we know have received money from the kind of donors that, you know, would make you concerned. Big tobacco, oil companies, you know, companies that have an interest in pushing particular agendas. And what's interesting in recent years is the think tank lobby in Britain probably has become more powerful than it ever was before. It has more access to the media, but also much more access to politicians. A lot of Britain's right-wing think tanks, or libertarian as a lot of them describe themselves, were very pro-Brexit before Brexit had happened. A lot of them were Eurosceptic. And after the Brexit process, they became far more important and influential. They were listened more by government ministers, and I know from my research that a lot of them had multiple meetings with government ministers, sometimes off the records, off the books, but also they appeared much more on television, on debates. And one striking fact was the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is the oldest of these think tanks, which is based near Tufton Street, which is a street in central London near Westminster that's got all these think tanks. Recently they said that they reckon that despite their turnover for the year was about £2 million, but they'd registered £66 million worth of advertising from their media appearances. That's how often these think tanks were able to get access to the media. Politicians often increasingly rely on think tanks to come up with ideas for them because there isn't much policy making within parties anymore. So these think tanks have been able to shift the terms of debate in Britain in ways in which we just don't know about, because we do not know fundamentally where their donations and their money are coming from. So we don't know who's paying for these supposedly independent ideas. There's a really good case to say that the 2019 general election in Britain was the most dishonest, the most kind of fraudulent election, I would say, in British political history. We saw a huge amount of lies and disinformation going out on social media. Everything from the Conservatives rebranding their Twitter account as Fact Check UK during a live debate, to anonymous advertisements being pushed on social media, to huge amounts of just genuinely false information being put into the public domain. And what's really striking is 9 months later, nothing has changed. The laws that govern our politics haven't changed at all. We know that they don't work. It's so easy to break the electoral law without really any comeback. The maximum fine for breaking electoral law is £20,000. For political parties, that's just the cost of doing business. There's almost no laws at all on online politics, even though that's increasingly where parties spend all of their money. The government has said that they are going to reform electoral law, and they've picked one issue that they think is really important, which is voter ID. They want to bring in mandatory voter ID, even though there's almost no evidence in Britain of any voter impersonation taking place. I think there was 7 at the 2017 general election. So the British government has said they're going to fight a problem that doesn't exist, while they're ignoring the huge glaring holes in electoral law that allow dirty campaigns to take place. And one would almost wonder, is the reason they don't want to do something about it because they think they can gain an advantage from it? The story of the rise of the kind of populist right has clearly been the big political story, arguably the last kind of decade. Donald Trump, the Brexit vote, lots across Europe of far-right parties doing incredibly well, historically well, in elections. And there's lots of reasons why you could say why populism is on the rise. The rise of economic uncertainty, concerns about changing societies. There's lots of reasons why this is happening. But one part of it which I think we don't think about or talk about enough is the role of dark money, of unaccountable money, and of networks of influence and control behind political parties and behind these wider movements. And when I was writing this book, one of the things I was really struck by was how so many of these nationalists are really transnationalists. They're really connected all around the world with each other while being very nationalistic. So take, for example, I looked at an organisation called the World Congress of Families. And what that is a Christian organization, a Christian right organization set up by American evangelicals and Russian Orthodox fundamentalists. And what that does is it pushes narratives around the family, huge fearful narratives around immigration, and people like Viktor Orban has addressed it. Matteo Salvini, the leader of the League in Italy, has addressed the World Congress of Families. And what we've seen is these groups are involved in things like the World Congress of Families, spend millions, tens of millions of pounds in Europe every year, often unaccountable, on political campaigning. So what you're able to see is that these might be populists and nationalists talking about protecting their own borders, but actually very frequently they get involved in politics all around the world in lots of different places. A really good example of that, and someone I interviewed for my book, is Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon's the ultimate nationalist, railing against the globalists of the world, but he goes around the world doing this. He has links to just about every European right-wing movement, from Hungary to Italy to, of course, in Britain. He was very close and still is very close to Nigel Farage. And Steve Bannon told me when I was interviewing him for my book that when Nigel Farage was thinking about setting up the Brexit Party in early 2019, he came to see Steve in America before CPAC, which is the big conservative Republican annual conference in America, and they sat and they talked about the Brexit Party and how it should work and how it might be able to succeed. And a few months later, obviously, the Brexit Party topped the poll in a vote for the European election here in Britain, registering 30% of the vote. So what you are seeing is these international links of people are able to take advantage of the circumstances that exist that are fueling the rise of populism, but are also able to really kind of hype that up and are, I think, are really integral in this kind of populist wave that we're seeing. It's not just voters that are voting for populists, it's the populists themselves who are able to connect with one another, able to use money and influence to kind of gain control and to see what works in different places, which I think is also really interesting. They often learn from one another, they advise one another, so all these nationalists are really internationalists. A great example of the way in which dark money has changed our politics and fueled the rise of populism is George Soros. The whole myth around Soros, this billionaire philanthropist, as this kind of evil guy who wants to take over the world. And that's become a real trope, not just in the rise of American politics, but across Europe. And what's really interesting is how that myth has taken hold in certain places. And more than anywhere else, it's taken hold in Hungary. And Hungary is a country in which Soros actually was born. He's a Jewish emigre who escaped the Holocaust, really, in Europe in the 1940s for America. And in Hungary, after the wall fell down and in the years kind of leading up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, Soros was a big funder of democratic organizations and institutions in this kind of new emerging Hungary. Now, George Soros is public enemy #1 in Hungary. Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, has plastered Soros's face everywhere. He accuses Soros of trying to kind of undermine Hungary, of not being a real Hungarian, of having all sorts of nefarious designs upon the Hungarian people. And it's really worked for Viktor Orban. He's been in power for over 10 years now. He's unassailed in Hungary. And a lot of the Hungarian population, if you ask them, think George Soros is a really scary menace to their way of life. But how did Viktor Orban decide to attack George Soros? And I think this is a really interesting story because actually Viktor Orban initially had been a kind of liberal. He'd actually been funded by Soros in the 80s. He'd early in kind of independent Hungary, he'd been an MP for a liberal party. He'd never been particularly anti-Soros. But in kind of the mid-2000s, when he was out of power, Viktor Orban met Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the Israeli Prime Minister, and Benjamin Netanyahu introduced him to a man called Arthur Finkelstein. And Arthur Finkelstein was, for a long time, a senior Republican political strategist in the US. He'd worked for Richard Nixon, for lots of other US Republican senior politicians. And Finkelstein was a really hard-nosed PR man. He really would push it as far as it could go. And what Finkelstein said to Viktor Orban was, you need to find an enemy, you need a bogeyman, you need somebody that you can tell the people that you are defending them against. As for many years, Republicans in America used to have the communists as the bogeyman. And Finkelstein said you should choose George Soros as that bogeyman. George Soros can be the person that you are defending Hungary against. So remarkably, a man, Finkelstein, whose family had also escaped the Holocaust, just like George Soros, came up with the very idea of Soros as the bogeyman for Viktor Orban. And Viktor Orban took that. He paid Arthur Finkelstein money to advise him. They were very close. He used to call him Finky. Finkelstein is now dead. And that whole kind of agenda, the anti-Soros agenda, at the heart of Hungary's politics, and actually lots of other European states' politics too, that's how it became mainstreamed. Dark money isn't just about political donations or even secret lobbying. It's also about how data and the whole online world of politics can be used and manipulated in ways that we as voters just cannot see. And if you think back 10 years ago, if you got an advert for a politician, it came through your door, it was a leaflet, it had their name on it, it said who's paid for it, you kind of knew what it said, there was a smiling politician's face, and everyone got the same advert. It was the same message on the side of the bus that everyone saw. Now our politics is really different. You will get targeted adverts on Facebook about politicians. They won't tell you who paid for them, and you will never actually be able to find out how exactly your data was used to find you. So it's totally transformed it. But we don't have any laws about online politics. So whatever you do online, almost anything is legal. So what that means is that politics is migrated online, more and more money is spent online, but we know less and less about it. Indeed, we almost know nothing about how politics is done online at the moment. And that's allowed tech platforms and the way tech platforms are run to have a huge influence on our democracy. So if you take Facebook, for example, as the kind of biggest behemoth on it, Facebook has said that it will continue to run paid for political ads even if what's in those ads isn't true. It won't fact check political ads. It will fact check other types of ads, but it will not fact check other political ads. What does that mean? It means politicians can really say whatever they want and get away with it without any comeback for it, because Facebook will let them do it. And Facebook will also let them target those adverts at very specific groups of voters. That means that both online can influence how we vote, influence elections, but it also means that Facebook itself as a company is incredibly powerful. It's really important then for politicians to almost get on with Facebook. It's important that Facebook doesn't feel like it feels like it's got a seat at the table, and people will listen to Facebook and have to take its views into account. We know that Mark Zuckerberg has had private meetings, say, with Donald Trump. It's not a surprise that Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook's founder, is very against candidates who have said that Facebook should be regulated more, that Facebook should be broken up because it's too much of a monopoly. So Facebook is actually able to influence the political process in ways that it wants itself. That's a very damaging and dangerous place for democracy to be. Big tech has changed how politics works. It's made it more divisive, I think. Social media has encouraged us to get, all of us, to get more angry, to fulminate more, to get more just aggressive about politics. And it's in their interest because that drives more clicks, it drives more advertising revenue. So it's a mishmash. We're hoping that big tech companies are going to help us to make a more civilized democratic debate at the same time as it's not in their financial interest to. So rather than expecting big tech companies to do something that's not in their interest, I think it's really important that governments and states around the world actually decide to act for themselves. We shouldn't be outsourcing the regulation of our democracy to tech companies in Silicon Valley. We should be taking responsibility of it ourselves. The electoral law in Britain is only about 20 years old. But it was written purely for an analogue age. It hasn't kept up pace at all with changes, and indeed the government has intentionally not tried to do things like address things that have happened in the last 2 decades, even though our whole world has really been transformed. We are in a digital age. And unless we have an electoral system that's fit for the digital age, it is completely and utterly ripe and open for abuse. It's open for abuse from all sides, from money, from lobbying, and also for the use of technology itself to warp and change our politics and our political debate. It's not hard, I think, to compare Silicon Valley and the power of a small number of companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon, to the railroad companies, say in America in the late 19th century, which were monopolies. These were companies that they owned the railroad, so they could control everything. They could charge whatever they wanted. And that's how big tech companies are now. They are monopoly players. We have rules about monopolies. We're not supposed to allow them to take place. We try and break them up. Why have we allowed a small number of companies to become huge monopolies, bigger than the GDPs of many countries, more powerful than many elected heads of state? And we've allowed that to happen. Our successive governments have allowed that to happen. And what that's meant is that a small number of people have a hugely outsourced role and pull, not just in politics in Britain, but in politics across the world, and are able to set the agenda in ways that suit the things that they want to happen. That to me doesn't feel democratic, and it doesn't feel like it respects what citizens need and want. A study was published early this year by Cambridge University, and it found that a lot of people around the world are dissatisfied with democracy. They're disenchanted with the political process as we know it. So it was really interesting. The 2 countries in which the highest levels of dissatisfaction were the United States and the United Kingdom. These are 2 countries which have a huge role for private money in politics. These are countries in which politicians have to go out and they try and raise money themselves. And what I think that's done is it's allowed this kind of dark money, this unaccountable money, this kind of secretive lobbying to infect really the body politic. It's spread like a sickness. It's eroded so much trust, I think, among citizens when it comes to politics. And the only solution, I think, is to try and take money out of politics properly. Because we are facing, like the climate emergency, I think a tipping point for democracy. We're seeing this rising dissatisfaction. Voters are going to populists all around the world. But also, they're staying at home, they're not voting, they're apathetic. There has to be something done where we try and re-engage people in democracy. And I think the only way we can do that properly is by reforming the way democracy itself is done. Because at the moment it is a rigged system. It is a system that benefits those who understand how to play it, and who understand, I think, how to play on fear and emotion to really drive political messages that at the end of the day often benefit them financially and politically rather than the people that they're purportedly saying it will actually help. What we know as well is that the ideas, the policies that get discussed by politicians can be very heavily influenced by political donors and by corporate money. Whether that's donors to political parties sitting next to a politician at a dinner, as happened with Robert Jenrick recently, and being able to lobby them to get planning permission for things that they want, or to ask questions in Parliament, but also the very idea of politics, the ideas that are discussed by politicians can be influenced by corporate money. You could pay a think tank £50,000 to write a report that will be cited in newspapers, discussed on televisions. No one will ever have to know where the money for that paid for that report came from. Next thing you know, that can easily become government policy. What we're seeing is the distance between the ideas that are discussed and the money of politics is becoming closer and closer together. So if you have a particular interest and if you're willing to spend money on it, you mightn't have to spend all that money to see that interest rise up the political agenda and become government policy. And I think that's also, there's a lack of transparency and there's a real worry, I think, about how money can influence the very things that government does and the very ideas that are espoused by politicians. It's easy to be gloomy about the state of our politics. It's easy to be gloomy that this isn't going to change, that things are only going to get worse, that dark money, that secretive lobbying is going to become an even bigger part of our politics in the years to come. But it doesn't have to be like that. There are reasons to be optimistic. The system could be changed. It wouldn't even be that difficult. We could say make the maximum donation from an individual £10,000 a year. That would help. We could make joining a political party tax deductible. That would help. We could regulate the internet properly so disinformation can't spread like wildfire. And that would really help. These are all things that our government could do. These are all things that collectively we could do to make our politics better, to take the money, to take the darkness out of our politics. And what we need first for that to happen is some political will. So push for this, and maybe we will actually get some change.